Welcome to today's program titled CBD News You Can Use, FDA's Progress and Other Updates. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. We will conduct a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the text box on your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation that will be required on the CLE attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down. It will not be reread, and it is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Tanya Esposito and Renee Appel. Speakers, you may begin.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank everyone today for joining us for this webinar on CBD. We are going to spend some time today talking through some updates that we'll review with you shortly, but before we get into it, just wanted to give you a little legal disclaimer that the presentation we're providing today is really intended for informational purposes and should not be construed as legal advice or as a legal opinion on any specific fact or circumstance. And so if you have specific questions, we encourage you to engage with counsel, and we're certainly here if you would like to reach out, if we can help you with any of those specific questions. Today, I am joined with my colleague, Renee Appel, and she will introduce herself momentarily, but I just wanted to give you a few words about who I am. I'm a partner in the Washington office, and I am co-chair of the firm's consumer financial services practice, but I do a wide variety of consumer protection work, including work that obviously covers many products, consumer products that is, that deal with CBD, and that's why I'm here today speaking with you. We do litigation, counseling, enforcement actions, internal investigations, and beyond. And I'll let Renee give you a few words about her practice. Renee?
Thank you, Tanya, and echoing Tanya's sentiments, thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I am an associate in the DC office of Seyfarth Shaw, and I also work in the consumer and retail and marketing space, working with clients both on the proactive side of developing compliant products and marketing materials and labeling, and then also on the enforcement side and defense side in responding to class action litigation as well as enforcement actions. And so looking forward to presenting to you all today, and thank you again for being here. Tanya, if you're speaking, I believe you're on mute.
My apologies. I was on mute. Thank you, Renee. Thanks, everyone, and sorry about that. So this is our agenda for today. Renee's going to kick us off with an overview, which will essentially review some of the fundamentals and basics that we'll be talking about when we use terms throughout this presentation. And if you've taken any of our prior webinars, this will likely be repeat information, but nevertheless, we think it's important to share it again, just so that as we talk through the specific regulatory issues and enforcement issues, everybody's sort of on the same page and has the same understanding. And so Renee, of course, I just mentioned, will start off with that. I am going to talk to you about what the FDA has done of late in connection with CBD. There has been some activity and some important information to share. We're also going to touch upon enforcement activity and litigation. We're going to look to what the states are doing in terms of regulating CBD, which is a subject matter that I think could probably take up an entire presentation on its own, but nonetheless, we're going to condense it and present it to you in short form so that you have some understanding of what's happening with the states. We're going to speak a little bit about CBD in food and supplements, as well as cosmetics. And then we're going to end by talking about some federal legislation and lobbying activity, all by way of an update. And so with that, I will turn it over to Renee.
Great, thank you. So we find it helpful whenever we present on this topic of CBD to go back over what we call the basics or the fundamentals of cannabis and CBD. The reason being is that there is a lot of misinformation out there, and there's not a level of consistency across the rules and regulations governing cannabis. And as a result, that's why we have this patchwork of regulatory regime and inconsistency across the state and federal oversight, which we'll get into. So to begin, we'll talk about, what is cannabis? Cannabis is the flowering plant that's sort of the overarching piece of the whole puzzle. And there are 3 different primary species of cannabis. You have Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and Cannabis ruderale. And as I listed those off, they're listed off in order of sort of their potency levels. And traditionally, when you hear people talk about Cannabis sativa, they're referring to a variety of it being marijuana or hemp. So hemp and marijuana are not species of the cannabis plant, but rather they're broad classifications of the cannabis plant. And when people talk about marijuana, it typically consists of dried flowers and leaves of the cannabis plant. And the distinction with marijuana is that it contains a high level of THC as compared to other classifications of the cannabis plant. And those THC levels can go anywhere from 5 to 35%, which makes it a psychoactive product. So it really is important to understand that when we get into talking about CBD, is that it could come from any number of these types of marijuana plants. And when it comes to regulatory side, obviously marijuana is illegal at the federal level, but we have many states that have allowed for the possession and use of marijuana for medicinal and recreational purposes. So then we get into what is hemp. And hemp is what sort of made waves in light of the Farm Bill in 2018, in which hemp was no longer classified as a Schedule I drug. And the way that hemp is defined is a Cannabis sativa L and any part of the plant, including the seeds thereof, and all derivatives, extracts, cannabinoids, isomers, acids, salts, and salts of isomers, whether growing or not, with THC concentration of not more than 0.3% on a dry weighted basis. So the distinguishing factor when Congress came up with this definition of hemp is that it contains a small amount of THC, a low level that wouldn't necessarily be considered as capable of giving a psychoactive effect. And hemp has, been in use for centuries. It's said that our Constitution is written on, hemp fiber paper. And of course, the uses have evolved over time, where we see the use of hemp in textiles, clothing, paint, fiber, cosmetics, and other products. So it was really considered a win when the Farm Bill was enacted to set a level of clarity, or so we thought, that hemp was distinguishable from other forms of cannabis. So as a result of the Farm Bill, hemp is no longer considered a controlled substance. We get into some murky waters when we start talking about cannabidiol, which is more popularly known as CBD, because CBD can in fact be derived from forms of cannabis, including either marijuana or hemp. So when people refer to CBD, there isn't always a universal understanding and definition of it because of the fact that it can be derived from different strands of the cannabis plant. Now, CBD is a cannabinoid, and there are over 480 cannabinoids that are in each plant, and they vary by their interaction with the human brain and the nervous system, and how they react to, how our brain receptors react to those cannabinoids, with THC being the most popular, identified as being psychoactive and having an effect on humans. And going back to what we talked about earlier as far as the varying types of cannabis, I mean, that's why there are so many different iterations of marijuana and how it's sold, because you start at the top of the potency with cannabis ruderalis, and it being so potent, you really don't see it being consumed directly, but really used in hybrids and other forms of consumer use for medicinal or recreational purposes where it's legal. So because of that, CBD has different levels across the varying plants of where it may be derived from. And it also varies based on how it's extracted and what percentage of it is extracted. So here is just a brief graphic that describes the variations of CBD, and these may be terms that you've come across on product labeling or marketing, which is full spectrum, broad spectrum, and an isolate. As it indicates, full spectrum contains CBD along with other cannabinoids and phytonutrients. The purity level obviously increases as we move right, with the second being broad spectrum. It's a whole plant minus THC. And then when you see CBD isolate, that is just CBD, no THC, no terpenes, no other cannabinoids that may provide for an alternative aroma or other collective effects of the CBD product. So as we'll get into, the issues is largely surround, CBD and whether or not it is legal when it's derived from hemp. Going back to the definition that Congress came up with, they specifically said that hemp included all derivative extracts and cannabinoids derived therefrom. But as Tanya will get into, there is a little bit of disagreement by what the FDA has to say on that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tanya.
Great. Thank you, Renee. So as I mentioned when we started, there's a lot of important sort of background knowledge that you kind of have to wrap your head around when you're looking at how we're progressing down the regulatory landscape. And so what we're going to do now is take a look at what the FDA has said about CBD. And for anyone on this call who has been following the issue, you may recall that back in May of 2019, the FDA's working group had a pretty popular and widely publicized public hearing for stakeholders where they were able to communicate with the FDA about their experiences, their challenges, ask questions, share information and request information about product safety, et cetera, et cetera. And, and during that public hearing, these participants, as I mentioned, were allowed to speak freely about their thoughts. Those thoughts were captured. There was a lot of sort of information provided by the marketplace to the FDA. And at the time, the FDA made it clear that selling a food or dietary supplement containing CBD is illegal. And this has really been in almost everything they've publicized and said about CBD since they've been talking about it. And so this continues to be obviously the FDA's position, and they continue to, make that very, very clear on their website in any sort of public-facing commentary they're providing, et cetera. But this, of course, has not stopped the marketplace from engaging in producing products or putting products on the marketplace that are food products or products that are intended for human consumption that contain CBD. And that is something that we see prevalent both in an online space as well as in brick and mortar stores. And so all of us were anxiously awaiting a report that was anticipated as the result of this, or as the product, I should say, of this May 2019 public hearing, because that certainly was what was communicated by the FDA, or what we were expecting to see. And so we fast forward to March of 2020, we see that the FDA produced a status report. And in that status report, essentially it was something that was requested by Congress. So Congress was putting some pressure on the agency to give them guidance as to what their thoughts were on the use of CBD and what their conclusions were, to the extent they could draw any, based on the meeting in 2019. And this report that was produced in March outlined the agency's progress in developing the regulatory framework on CBD and foods and dietary supplements, but essentially it highlighted for Congress the work that it's done since that 2019 hearing. And so it's evaluated lots of scientific information. It's worked with government bodies at all levels to talk about the regulation of cannabis and CBD. And there's been a lot of work put into meeting with state leadership throughout the country to talk about the agricultural component of regulating CBD. And so while this report certainly was perceived as helpful to the marketplace, there are lots of questions that remain unanswered, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But as you see, Dr. Abernathy tweeted on March 12, as part of our work announced last week, we're encouraging, facilitating, and initiating more research on CBD, providing venues for industry and researchers to share new data with the FDA, and identifying opportunities to further collaborate with federal partners. And Dr. Abernathy has essentially been the voice of the FDA on the issue of CBD, and that's really sort of the last bit of public commentary we've seen from her on this topic. And so, as I just mentioned, this status report, while helpful, left a lot of questions unanswered. And these are the questions that the FDA reported out remain unanswered. And these are fairly critical questions for the marketplace for purposes of developing, a regulatory landscape that market players can adhere to, for purposes of businesses who are trying to stay compliant with the law, need answers to these questions. And so, for example, the sustainability, like if you're taking CBD for a sustained period of time, what are the effects of that? What does that mean? We still need more research on that. Risks associated, different methods of exposure and how they affect intake. So oral versus topical versus smoking or vaping. The effect of CBD on the developing brain. So what about children? What's the effect there? Unborn children and moms who are breastfeeding newborns. How does CBD interact with other herbs and botanicals? There's also a need for information about CBD and male reproductive toxicity in humans. And, differing safety concerns for use in certain animal species, breeds, and classes, and finally, residues that can be formed in edible tissues of food-producing animals. So these are all obviously very critically important questions that we need answers to, and ones that the FDA identified itself in this report. Now, fast forward to July 2020, the FDA submitted a report outlining the results of the agency's sampling and testing of certain CBD products in the marketplace. And as a part of this report, the FDA conducted extensive testing of CBD products that are on the market that it selected and tested, and the results are pretty interesting. And as you can see from the slide, many of the products tested contained THC or other cannabinoids, and in amounts that were in excess of the labeling. So, for example, hemp products which were marketed or purported to be THC free actually contained THC. And so the finding and takeaway here was that, there still is a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace as to product sourcing, product testing, product labeling, and we anticipate that this is going to inform, any regulatory landscape or guidance that we see going forward in terms of there being potentially a mandatory testing element for any products that, are placed in the marketplace. And then in July 2020, we also saw the FDA issue some regulatory guidance. And this guidance focuses on clinical research related to the development of drugs containing cannabis or cannabis-derived compounds. And it's really just limited to the development of human drugs and doesn't cover any of the other FDA-regulated products. And so again, that was published in July of 2020. And July was an active month. And so in July 2020, we also saw a draft policy that the FDA submitted on CBD to the White House for approval. And so upon approval from the OMB, which has to sign off on this regulation or any regulation that matter from a federal agency, we assume there'll be a public release of the policy shortly thereafter, but at this juncture, it's not yet public, and we don't have the information to really share with you as to what's in that draft policy. But we note that it's marked not economically significant, which means it's expected to have less than $100 million impact. And you can see from the slide, this is what's publicly available, or the information available about this policy, and it's still pending review. Now, in August of 2020, the FDA issued a notice basically saying that it's looking for some help. It wants to study CBD more. It wants to develop regulations for products containing the non-intoxicating cannabinoid, and it wants to collect samples, assess quantities, look at the toxicity of these products, and really get a better understanding and a better library of information to help them further down this path of creating a regulatory landscape. And per their own words, they say the results of these studies will not only be reported to Congress, but really used to help guide the development of future policy and develop better understanding of quantities of CBD and the distribution of the same, and just general information for the marketplace to help this path move forward. And their goal is to obtain 1,000 to 3,000 samples of CBD-infused baked goods, chocolates, candies, oils, concentrates, tinctures, capsules, etc., from all around the country. And the FDA also announced in September 2020 that it's looking at the issue of sex and gender as it relates to CBD and other cannabinoids. And this came from the FDA's Office of Women's Health. And so, as you can see, they're expanding their exploration of the effects of CBD into both sex and gender, and soliciting information from the public on this important topic as well. Beyond that, the FDA continues to express concerns about potential safety risks for CBD and problems related to a number of currently marketed CBD products, and the potential for mislabeling or contamination, not only in terms of mislabeling as it relates to whether or not the product contains THC, but also pesticides and heavy metals. And so since May 31st of 2019, which was when they had the public meeting, that was sort of the very big meeting, and we were expecting to have some form of a more robust report from them, the available data has further demonstrated that CBD truly is not a risk-free substance. And so some of the sort of studies have shown that there's potential for liver injury, drowsiness, potential for drug interactions, and of course, male reproductive issues. And, the FDA is also quite concerned with the effects of CBD on the body, again, with regular ingestion over a period of time and cumulative exposure. So these are really the issues that are of particular importance to the FDA and where we expect them to focus their time in the near future and for purposes of coming up with further guidance for the marketplace. And with that, I'm going to let Renee speak to some enforcement activity and litigation.
Thank you, Tanya. So just hanging on the last piece that Tanya just shared with you all, to tie it back to where we started, part of the reason that the FDA is so concerned with getting more data is because, as we talked about, there's just a variety of CBD extracts that are making their way into consumer products that, before the FDA comes up with some sort of universal system of what's going to be okay and legal in their eyes, they have to really comprehend and understand sort of what are the effects of all the different variations, and if there's a way to limit it to just hemp-derived to really make it safe for everyone. So with that, getting into sort of the FDA obviously still has a position that CBD is not a legal substance. And the way they get there is because of the exclusionary clause of the FTC Act, which provides that products that are undergoing research or products that have required formal approval, before being released as a new drug, those products cannot be distributed without FDA approval. So we see the FDA still monitoring the market for products. And in the past, in 2019, what we saw was FDA going after the manufacturers and the distributors directly. In 2020, we've seen an evolution of the reach of the FDA. So we'll start with the example there with the Homero Corp. They were a manufacturer of CBD products, both for humans and for animals. And FDA scoured their social media platforms and their direct website and issued a warning letter saying that the products being sold were unapproved new drugs. And, for the reasons I just stated, that they're still, FDA is operating under the exclusionary clause, that these types of products containing CBD are not legal without pre-approval from the FDA. What's more novel in the past year is the action taken against marketers and retailers. So CBD Gaze, for example, is a participant in a third-party sales referral program. So they're not the direct manufacturer or distributor of the product, but rather a middleman marketer. and they're just promoting and profiting from the sale. You click on their website, they refer you out, and they earn the commission. And because their website advertises these CBD products as mitigating and preventing or otherwise treating a disease, and in this case it was COVID-19, once again, we have the FDA coming down on them and saying, hey, you're promoting and facilitating the sale of unapproved drugs, and you're not permitted to do so. So the other category we've seen is the retailers. So the example presented is the CBD online store, where you can actually go to the website and purchase CBD products directly. But again, the FDA is picking up on the fact that websites touting that these products are intended to be used as drugs because of the promises they're representing to consumers as to treating COVID-19 in this case. So we've seen the FTC pursuing retailers, particularly those online, and also market affiliates. And it's really sending a message similar to what we've seen the FTC do as it relates to influencers. That is to say, if you're part of the economic system that is promoting and otherwise facilitating the sale of these otherwise unauthorized products, that the FDA will contact you. And in this particular case, first level was through these warning letters. What we also had this year was what the FTC described as the perfect storm through Mark Ching and his company Whole Leaf Organics. This is the first actual action we saw beyond a traditional warning letter. And in this case, it actually had begun as far as enforcement activity back in 2019 when the FTC sent a warning letter to the company. And then because it was not heeded to in April 2020, they filed a complaint for the FTC. And the complaint alleged that there were various products, namely a vitamin C pill, but also products containing CBD and hemp extracts that were being marketed as scientifically proven to treat cancer. For example, one of the products, CBD products, was advertised as it combines the best in cancer fighting elements into one simple capsule. But there's no scientific evidence to back such claims, and the CBD products would be treated as drugs under the FTC Act. So we see the FTC elevating beyond, combined warning letters and its own warning letters that it issued in 2019 to say, if you're not going to respond to our warnings, we're going to escalate. And that was the case here, and it ultimately was resolved by a consent order. We also see in FTC versus Cushley that the FTC is pursuing other methods of enforcement. In that case, the FTC issued a civil investigation demand, a CID, to determine whether certain health claims made in the company's marketing materials were deceptive. And in that case, Cushley did not respond, which caused the FTC to file a petition to enforce. And in August, the court issued a show cause order against Cushley, for responding to why they did not adhere to the FTC's first CID. So suffice to say, we do see both the FDA and FTC continuing to monitor CBD and also escalate the type of enforcement activity that they're authorized to utilize. Now, obviously, with everything in the regulatory environment, things have gotten a little skewed with COVID-19, but there's been an overlap where the FDA and FTC sent warning letters to companies that were selling CBD products as being capable of treating and otherwise during COVID-19. What was unique about these letters is that they required immediate action, whereas in the past, other letters normally require a couple weeks period of time for there to be a response and for there to be some sort of cure period. But, the agencies are obviously taking COVID-19 with a higher level of concern and therefore accordingly ask for more immediate action. So that provides an overview of what we see in the government doing and that type of activity that we've seen over the last year. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about class action activity. So what has been novel to 2020 is that we're starting to see a rise in class action securities-related lawsuits. So these aren't your traditional consumer class actions that are driving, but rather by investors and shareholders pursuing action against companies, either after the company receives a warning letter, or after there is some sort of regulatory activity against the company. To go back to the company and say, hey, you're not complying, you're not being consistent, and there's obviously reputational damage to the company, but obviously a financial impact, which prompts these types of class actions. On the other side of the coin, as it relates to the traditional consumer class actions, which really started in 2019 and have continued over the last year, there's kind of 5 areas that we see as far as themes on which those claims are related to, and that's supply of the product, purity and contamination. So going back to what we talked about earlier about the varying forms of CBD from the full spectrum to broad spectrum to isolate, misrepresentations about one or the other, for example, representing it as an isolate when in fact it contains THC, dose response claims, then the traditional labeling marketing claims, which there may be a little bit level of overlap, but again, using the example of a product representing a CBD isolate on the label when in fact it does contain THC. And then the last category being safety, misrepresentations or otherwise not performing adequate testing related to the CBD product. But another development that we have seen over the last year is that courts have shifted to relying on the concept of primary jurisdiction and staying these class actions. We've seen this in at least 6 of the federal courts involving false advertising cases and CBD products. So the way the primary jurisdiction doctrine works is that while a claim can be addressed by the court feels as though an administrative body or agency should consider the issue first. And I think we see a rise in this year is because, as Tanya went over, there's been a lot of FDA activity. Although it hasn't gotten us where the industry would like as far as a level of clarity, it has sent a message that the FDA is addressing this issue of CBD regulation. It's working on coming up with a regulatory or set of rules that will provide a consistent framework. So essentially, these courts are opting to pause litigation until the FDA completes its rulemaking regarding marketing, including the labeling of hemp-derived and ingestible products. So with that, I will turn it back over to Tanya to talk about the state's regulation of CBD.
Great. Thanks, Renee. And so if you're not confused enough already, and as I mentioned earlier, there's certainly a very broad range of state regulations to keep in mind that, have to really be examined, if you will, at the same time as looking at what the FDA has said about CBD. And so CBD's legality, the status of CBD, it varies across states. And so we've highlighted for you here in green states where it's, absolutely, clearly, unequivocally legal. But keep in mind that we consult various sources and websites pretty regularly because this landscape is actively changing. And so, for example, if you take a look at bills that are pending across states, there are numerous bills, and these are sort of, bounced back and forth in state legislatures pretty regularly. I mean, there's a lot of resources that are rightfully dedicated to coronavirus and all of the issues that present in connection with coronavirus. However, there's still a lot of activity in this space, and we anticipate, that this landscape will continue to evolve. And again, on any given day, it can change. And there are always a number of competing bills and comments that you can read, and various states that are being, relatively proactive and aggressive, and other states that, tend to sort of take or follow rather what neighboring states are doing, and certainly taking into consideration what that particular state's population wants and needs, whether it's, an agricultural state, whether there's another motivation for keeping CBD legal or, resisting against it being legal. There's a variety of views and opinions, and there's no shortage of thought on, how this should move forward. But we thought it would be useful to revisit again CBD in food supplements. And so this is a summary of the FDA's position on both dietary supplements and food. And as we've already discussed, the FDA has been very clear that, CBD should not be used in any food products that are being consumed or food that's intended for human consumption, and that to do so is currently illegal. And so, under the Food and Drug Cosmetics Act, any ingredient added to food or drink, such as food coloring, is a food additive. And so all food additives have to receive pre-market FDA approval to ensure that the additive is indeed safe for human consumption. And the only exception to pre-market FDA approval is recognized when the ingredient is referred to as generally recognized as safe, or GRAS. And as the result of the decades-long hemp prohibition, we really know relatively little about CBD and how it interacts with the human body. And so, although there have been a lot of entities that have said that CBD possesses a good safety profile or it's safe for human consumption, it still remains unclear whether the FDA will actually affirmatively establish CBD as, something that's safe for human consumption or generally recognized as safe. If we compare that to state regulation, as mentioned, it really just varies by state. And this can be incredibly frustrating for folks that are, in the market, or companies that want to enter the market, want to do it sort of on a nationwide scale. We're often counseling clients that want to move forward with incorporating CBD into their food products, but we work with them to navigate what is a fairly complicated set of state laws. And essentially what it requires at this juncture is to look at each state and see what that particular law, assuming there is law on the books, states, how it's being enforced. And at the end of the day, it really often turns into a situation where it's a business decision, and it is really, the client's decision to make in terms of what level of risk exposure it's comfortable with. And so generally speaking, state CBD regulations tend to fall into 4 categories, and this goes for CBD generally and CBD as it relates to food. You've got states that have laws that allow CBD sales, and so you can do, pretty much anything as it relates to CBD. You've got states that prohibit CBD, where there's no wiggle room. It's pretty clear that, or it's clear, I should say, that you cannot sell CBD legally. And then there are states that allow CBD sales but have certain labeling requirements. And those vary, depending on what state you're in. Some, have specific laws on the books that go to food groups, for example, dairy products. Some have specific requirements that say, you can sell a food product that contains CBD in this state, but you have to take these additional steps to get statewide approval, and you have to register with the Secretary of State, the agricultural governing body within the state, to identify what the products are, whether you've tested them, where you're sourcing your ingredients, et cetera. So that's, there are a handful of states that have approached it in that regard. And then there actually is a grouping of states that are operating in a very gray regulatory area. So what do I mean by that? No matter how many times you read the law that is currently on their books or in effect, it's difficult to decipher one way or another, how they come out on the issue of CBD, but in particular, CBD being incorporated into a food product. And so, on any given day, these types of issues are evolving. As I mentioned earlier, there's constantly new bills that are being presented, lots of discussion on the internet and in public forums about which way a state may go. And so, it just continues to evolve. And it's really, really important that if you are in this space, that you're at least relatively frequently, but I'd say, periodically looking at these developments to make sure that, A, you understand, what's happening, and B, you have a good appreciation for what the potential exposure could be. And, it's also important to talk a little bit about CBD in non-food products. And so the FDA has approved certain drugs that contain CBD or THC. So the first was a Pedialex, and this is a drug that contains a purified form of CBD, and it's indicated for the treatment of seizures. And that was approved by the FDA, I believe, almost 2 years ago now. We also have Marinol and Syndrose, and this contains an active ingredient that is a synthetic form of THC, and this particular drug is indicated for the treatment of anorexia associated with weight loss in individuals that have acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS. And a third drug worth mentioning is Sesamet, and this is a drug that contains the active ingredient nabilone, which has a chemical structure that's similar to THC but is synthetically derived. And this particular drug is indicated for the treatment of nausea and vomiting caused by cancer drugs treatments or chemotherapy. So we see that the FDA has recognize that there are instances where drugs that contain CBD or THC, in fact, can go through that approval process, but it certainly is a very long process, typically reasonably so, and an expensive one. But, we anticipate that we will continue to see these types of drugs enter the marketplace with FDA approval, but clearly there's lots of time, effort, energy, and resources that have to be put into this process before a drug can be approved. Looking quickly at cosmetics, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act defines cosmetics by their intended use, right? And so just straight from the FDA's words or the statute itself, they're articles intended to be rubbed, poured, sprinkled, or sprayed on, introduced into, or otherwise applied to the human body for cleansing, beautifying, promoting attractiveness, or altering the appearance. And among the products included in this definition are skin moisturizers, perfumes, lipsticks, fingernail polishes, eye and facial makeup, cleansing shampoos, permanent waves, hair colors, and deodorants, as well as any substance intended for use as a component of a cosmetic product, but does not include soap. But if the product is intended for therapeutic use, such as treating or preventing disease or to affect the structure or function of the body, it's a drug, or in some cases could even be a medical device if it affects the appearance. And other personal care products may be regulated as dietary supplements or as consumer products, depending on the product itself. So CBD cosmetics are not lawfully required to have FDA approval unless the product is advertised and used for medicinal purposes. And again, that process is long and expensive and cumbersome and complicated at this juncture. And so most manufacturers or companies that are putting CBD cosmetics or personal care products on the market don't have any intention of focusing on medicinal CBD beauty and skincare products. Their marketing may mention that CBD has healthful properties, and that's appropriate so long as the research is there to support it. But generally speaking, the approach in the marketplace is to not advertise cosmetics as having medicinal purposes. And that's certainly something that, we work with our client base on as well, because it can be a little tricky. It can be confusing. And, as Renee highlighted earlier, if you get too aggressive with claims, or if you don't have a good understanding of what this means in terms of the distinction between a medical claim versus, a therapeutic claim or a claim that can be supported by existing research, you can really expose yourself to not only an enforcement action, but potentially a class action or other form of litigation. And so some of the, areas or claims where we've seen, or there is existing research, I should say, that cosmetic companies can rely upon is very broadly that CBD is safe for human use, according to some preliminary and clinical studies that are publicly available. Dermatology research has found that CBD has potential as a promising therapeutic agent for acne. There's also some research as to its ability to aid with anti-inflammatory and antibacterial properties. And most importantly, unlike THC in marijuana, CBD doesn't cause any form of a high in any quantity. So that's something also that, can be used in marketing materials that is very widely and publicly supported. And with that, we're going to take a look at some federal legislation, and I'll let Renee take it from here.
Thank you, Tanya. And I just wanted to say one thing about, the last piece that you said, where, while there are some widely recognized claims, the FDA has kind of come down hard on CBD, obviously. And what we've seen is this issue where product manufacturers and the distributors they're getting representations from the supplier that may not be consistent with the end label. And that's where we see, issues with the class action litigation, where, while it may be appropriate to make a claim about the efficacy of the product or its purity or something else, that there's some sort of miscommunication or misrepresentation over the course of the production line, that there's a level of inconsistency. So a lot to think about, but as we get into this last section here, we want to talk briefly about federal legislation. So we largely talk about the FDA and FTC, which is obviously the biggest parties here as far as taking action. We do have a couple other agencies that have stepped up acknowledging this patchwork across the states. We have the United States Postal Service, which established a pretty lenient policy last year as far as shipping interstate hemp products, and saying, hey, if you're sending hemp products, as long as they're compliant with your state's law and federal law, and you have record of this, and you have your substantiation for the products being hemp as opposed to an alternative form of cannabis, hold that on record for 2 years, and you should be okay as far as getting your product out there across state lines. You also have the TSA, come out with a similar sort of a policy acknowledging this patchwork across the states, but basically adhering to the federal legislation from the Farm Bill to permit, the transport of products, but really sticking to the traditional definition of, medicinal marijuana, as opposed to sort of broad use to bring on the plane your recreational marijuana or other related products. And then we turn to Congress. What's Congress doing? So we've seen a few pieces of legislation that were successfully passed. Most recently this summer was the Hemp Victory Act with Representative Tulsi Gabbard, which was an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act to bar the Secretary of Defense from prohibiting the armed forces from the possession, use, or consumption of products containing hemp or any ingredient derived from hemp. We had the HEROES Act in May, which stands for the Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions Act, which you're probably all familiar with, but may not have known that they incorporated provisions from the Safe Banking Act to give cannabis businesses and their ancillary businesses a similar break that other small businesses were getting, so that they could access banking services such as loans, credit lines, and other accounts to support their businesses. And then toward the end of last year, we saw the passing of that Safe Banking Act, but it had got stuck in Senate, which is why you had the HEROES Act, which pushed things along to advance the needs, particularly the financial needs of these cannabis-related businesses. I'll pause real quickly to give you all the CLE code as I see we're running up against the hour, and that is SS1414. That's S as in Seyfarth, S as in Shaw, 1414. Just to give a quick look, we see a lot of bills that are pending in the House, really trying to push the agenda along for the cannabis businesses to get clarity and to find alternative avenues for the legitimate sale and distribution of hemp products. Most recently in September, Representatives Schrader and Griffith introduced the Hemp and Hemp-Derived CBD Consumer Protection Market Stabilization Act, and what they're trying to do is define hemp products as dietary supplements to sort of create a workaround the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and the exclusionary clauses that the FDA has been operating under. And then finally, just to touch base briefly, we see a lot of lobbying efforts. So a lot of trade associations and also businesses that are trying to, move things along and want to take advantage of selling products, in a compliant capacity. So we see various efforts of petitions, letters, and other forms of lobbying activity to push, efforts along, and we have seen the fruits of that by the recent legislation we just referenced. And then finally, real quick, we have seen litigation efforts that work in a similar capacity, with most recently the Hemp Industries Association filing an action. The DEA had proposed a modification of regulations, and this was part of the necessary work to carry out the 2018 Farm Bill. But there's a little bit of a hiccup in the way that they've defined marijuana extract with the, agriculturalists, those that are manufacturing the hemp and purifying it. They're concerned that in the process that they would be subject to criminalization of their work because there are extracts that don't quite meet the definition through the purifying process. So that's just to go over briefly what's sort of going on between private citizens, but also Congress and what they're doing to push the agenda along.
All right, thank you, Renee. And so we appreciate everyone joining us today. We hope you found it useful. And we just wanted to remind you that we will be doing these webinars frequently to keep everyone updated as the issues evolve. But in the meantime, we encourage you to follow the Seyfarth Shaw blog that is all things marijuana and CBD. It's called thebluntruth.com, and we have frequent, timely postings to the blog that, I think everyone who joined us today will find useful. Thank you so much.
And we'll just note, I see that we have received a number of questions, and for those that have submitted questions, we'll get back to you offline, provided our hour is up, and we appreciate them. Thank you.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for attending.